In 1981, a train blocked firemen responding to a call, and then the entire crew vanished. For 34 years, the official story was that nothing was ever recovered. They were simply gone. But then, 34 years later, their equipment was found. Not at the scene of the fire, but hidden deep inside a sealed, abandoned tunnel. A tunnel that, according to official records, was never even there. As the fire chief's daughter started asking questions about what happened to her father, a single, terrifying note appeared on her car. "If you keep looking, you'll end up where they did." What secrets were buried in that tunnel? And who was willing to do anything to make sure they stayed that way? Subscribe now so you won't miss similar chilling stories on our channel in the future. And tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there. We love seeing where our audience tunes in from. It began, as so many life-altering discoveries do, not with a bang, but with the quiet scent of mothballs and forgotten things. The first Saturday of October felt brittle, the air holding a chill that promised an early winter. Anna Cole, a woman whose life had settled into the predictable rhythms of a school librarian, was volunteering at the annual church rummage sale. She sifted through boxes of donated housewares in the damp, musty basement of Street Jude's, the scent of dust and old paper, a comfort she'd known her whole life. One box, however, was different. It was filled with the sad remnants of someone's workshop, tangled wires, mismatched screws, and a collection of rusted tools. And at the bottom, nestled in a bed of wood shavings, was a small, heavy object, a fireman's whistle. It was made of brass, now tarnished a murky green-brown with age, and dented in several places as if it had been dropped or thrown with great force. It was the kind of thing most people would pass over, a piece of junk. But Anna's breath caught in her throat. Her father, Fire Chief Daniel Cole, had carried one just like it. He used to blow it in 3 sharp bursts from the front porch to call her and her brother Mark home for dinner, a sound that sliced through the twilight of their childhood summers. Her fingers, trembling slightly, closed around the cool metal. She turned it over, and there, scratched crudely but clearly into the surface, were 2 letters, D.C. Daniel Cole. A ghost in her hand, a relic from a man who, along with his entire crew, had vanished into smoke and history in 1981. The official story, repeated for 34 years until it became as solid and unquestionable as a gravestone, was that no personal belongings were ever found. The fire, the blocked train tracks, the ensuing chaos, it had supposedly consumed everything, yet here it was. Proof. But proof of what? Anna felt a dizzying surge of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in decades, a fragile, terrifying hope. For a moment, she was no longer a middle-aged mother and librarian, but the little girl who had waited by the window for a father who never came home. The cold of the basement seemed to seep into her bones, but the whistle was warm in her palm, a flicker of life against the long, cold silence. This object shouldn't exist. Its presence in this dusty box was a contradiction, a tear in the fabric of the story her town had told itself for a generation. Someone had kept it. Someone had hidden it. And now, for reasons she couldn't possibly guess, someone had let it go. Clutching the whistle so tightly her knuckles turned white, Anna left the church without a word to anyone. Her first stop was the Benton Creek Historical Society, a sterile, quiet building that served as the official keeper of the town's memory. Mr. Abernathy, the curator, was a man with a soft voice and eyes that seemed to have faded behind his thick glasses. He listened with a practiced, weary patience as Anna explained where she'd found the whistle. He took it from her, examined the initials with a dismissive glance, and set it down on his desk as if it were a common stone. "Mrs. Cole," he began, his tone dripping with condescension. "Your father was a hero, we all know that. But this could be anyone's. There were probably dozens of these things floating around back then." Anna's hope curdled into a hot, simmering anger. "It has his initials," she insisted, her voice sharper than she intended. "The official report said nothing was recovered. Nothing. This proves the report was wrong." Abernathy sighed, a long, drawn-out sound of a man burdened by the emotional theatrics of others. "Sometimes it's best to let old wounds lie. Stirring this up, It won't bring him back. It will only cause pain for the other families. He pushed the whistle back across the desk toward her. It was a warning, cloaked in sympathy. Go home. Forget this. The town has moved on. You should too. She left the historical society feeling smaller, colder, than when she had entered. The institution had spoken. The truth was not welcome here. Her hands shook as she dialed her brother's number. Mark had always been the pragmatic one, the anchor to her dreamer. He listened to her story, the lines silent for a long time after she finished. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight with a familiar, suffocating fear. "Anna, no," he said, the words a plea. "Please, don't do this. Don't start this." "Start what?" She shot back, the rejection from Abernathy still stinging. "Start asking questions about our own father?" "I remember what this did to Mom," Mark said, his voice cracking. "I remember her sitting at the kitchen table for years, staring at the phone, waiting for it to ring. This obsession, it buried her long before she was gone. I won't watch you do the same thing to yourself. Let it go. For your daughter, for Lily, for me." The words hit her like a physical blow. He wasn't trying to protect the town's memory. He was trying to protect her, but it felt like a betrayal all the same. He was asking her to choose peace over truth, silence over their father. The rift between them, always present but dormant for years, yawned wide and deep. She hung up the phone, a profound loneliness settling over her. The world wanted her to forget. Her own brother wanted her to forget. She was alone with this tarnished piece of brass and the ghost it had awakened. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Anna sat in the dark of her living room, the whistle on the table in front of her, catching the faint moonlight. She was tempted to put it away, to listen to Mark, to let the silence reclaim its hold. It would be easier, safer. But then another memory surfaced, pushing through the fog of grief and time. It was the night before he disappeared. He had come to tuck her into bed, his uniform still smelling faintly of smoke and coffee. He had knelt beside her, his large calloused hands holding her small ones as they said their bedtime prayer. When they finished, she had clung to his arm. "You'll always come back, right, Daddy?" She'd whispered into the dark. He had smiled, a sad, tired smile she would see in her dreams for the rest of her life. "Always," he'd promised, his voice a low rumble. "I'll always come back for you." It wasn't just a memory, it was a vow, his vow to her, and now her vow to him. She would not let him remain a ghost, a convenient tragedy in the town's official history. She would uncover the truth, no matter the cost, no matter who stood in her way. It was the last promise she could keep for him. She picked up the whistle, her resolve hardening like steel. This was not an obsession. This was a duty. The next evening, after a long day at the library where every quiet moment was filled with the roar of her own thoughts, she walked out into the crisp autumn air. The sun was setting, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple. She felt a strange sense of purpose, of clarity. For the first time in 34 years, she wasn't just grieving a loss, she was fighting a battle. And as she approached her car, parked under the amber glow of a street lamp, she saw it. A small, white piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper. Her heart began to pound a frantic, heavy rhythm against her ribs. It wasn't a flyer. It wasn't an advertisement. It was a folded note. With numb fingers, she pulled it free and unfolded it. The letters were stark, blocky, and anonymous, pressed hard into the paper. 5 words that turned her blood to ice. "If you keep looking," it read, "you'll end up where they did." The empty street suddenly felt crowded, watched. The rustling of leaves in the wind sounded like footsteps. Someone knew she had the whistle. Someone knew she was asking questions. And someone was willing to do more than just warn her away with polite words. They were making a threat, a promise of their own, born from a secret that had been kept buried for a very, very long time. The battle had just begun. The note felt like a sliver of ice in her hand, a physical manifestation of the fear that had lived in the back of her mind for 34 years. Anna didn't go home. She couldn't. The walls of her house, usually a sanctuary, would feel like a cage, every shadow a lurking figure, every creak of the floorboards a footstep. She drove instead, her car a small, warm bubble against the vast, watchful night, the anonymous threat lying on the passenger seat. There was only one person in Benton Creek who might understand. One person who had been there that night and was not part of the polished, forgetful machinery of the town. Earl Simmons. A retired train engineer, Earl now lived in a small, cluttered house at the edge of town, where the tidy lawns gave way to overgrown fields and the rusting skeletons of old machinery. He had been a friend of her father's, a man who spoke in truths as rough and unvarnished as his hands. She found him on his front porch, sitting in a worn rocking chair, a halo of smoke from his pipe hanging in the cold air. He didn't seem surprised to see her, as if he'd been expecting a ghost from his past to arrive sooner or later. He listened without interruption, his eyes, cloudy with age but still sharp, fixed on her face. He took the brass whistle she offered, turning it over in his palm. He didn't need to look for the initials. He knew. "Danny's," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "I'd know it anywhere." He said it was his good luck charm. He handed it back to her, then took a long draw from his pipe. The sweet, acrid smell of cherry tobacco filled the silence. Anna told him about Abernathy's dismissal, about Mark's fear, and finally about the note. She watched his face, searching for a sign, any sign that she wasn't crazy. He tapped his pipe against the porch railing, embers falling like dying stars into the dark. "They don't want you digging," he said, stating the obvious. "Some things, people figure it's better they stay buried." A wave of despair washed over her. Not him too, not another voice telling her to let it go. "He was your friend," she said, her voice raw. "They were all your friends. Don't you want to know what happened to them?" Earl looked away, out toward the dark line of trees where the railroad tracks used to run. The silence stretched on, thick with unspoken history. For a moment she thought he was going to send her away. Another door closed in her face. "They said it was a track fire," he finally murmured, more to the night than to her. "That's what went out over the radio, but it wasn't much of a fire. I was running a freight train back from the city that night. Heard the call, saw the smoke, it was nothing. A pile of old ties someone probably set alight for a laugh. Nothing a crew like your dad's couldn't handle in 10 minutes. He paused, and the weight of his next words hung heavy in the air. The strange thing was the other call. The one that came later. Dispatch telling all traffic to halt. Said there was an unscheduled closure. A maintenance tunnel down by the old switching yard was being sealed. Effective immediately. Anna leaned forward, her heart pounding. "A tunnel?" Earl nodded slowly. "An old access tunnel. Hadn't been used in years. They filled it with concrete. Sealed it shut the very next morning. The morning after your father and his men disappeared. The cold on the porch had nothing to do with the autumn air. A lie, cast in concrete and steel, had been set in place while the town was still reeling in shock. Anna felt a surge of adrenaline, a dizzying, clarifying certainty. This was it. This was the first real thread she could pull. "Where was it, Earl? Can you show me?" He didn't answer right away. He got up, his old bones creaking, and disappeared into the house. Anna waited, the hope in her chest so fierce it was painful. He returned a few minutes later with a long, rolled-up tube of yellowed paper, tied with a brittle piece of twine. He undid the knot with his thick, slow fingers and spread it out on the small porch table. It was a railroad maintenance map from 1978. The paper so fragile it looked like it might turn to dust. The lines were faded, the names of old spurs and sidings barely legible. And there, near the bottom, in the mess of tracks that was once the bustling switching yard, was a small, dotted line leading to a rectangle labeled Maintenance Tunnel 7. And drawn over it, in faint, fading pencil, was a single, definitive X. "They sealed it so fast," Earl said, his finger hovering over the spot. "Said it was a public safety hazard, never made sense. A tunnel that wasn't on any of the new maps, that nobody used, suddenly becomes an emergency that has to be filled with tons of concrete overnight?" He rolled the map back up and pushed it toward her. "This is the only copy I know of. The official ones at the yard office, they disappeared around the same time." She took the map, her hands trembling. It felt heavier than a roll of paper. It felt like proof, like a weapon. For the first time since she'd found the whistle, she wasn't just a grieving daughter chasing ghosts. She was an investigator with a lead, a real lead. It was a dizzying, triumphant high. She had a place to look, a secret location that the town, the historical society, the official reports had erased from existence. She thanked Earl, her voice thick with emotion, and drove away from his house with the map beside her, a beacon in the darkness. The fear was still there, but now it had a counterpart, a fierce, burning resolve. She had a piece of the truth, and she would not let it go. The feeling of victory lasted until she pulled into her driveway. Her phone rang, the screen glowing with her brother's name. A small smile touched her lips. Maybe he'd had a change of heart. Maybe he'd come around. "Mark?" she said, answering with a lightness she hadn't felt all day. But his voice was a snarl of fury and panic. "What did you do, Anna? What in God's name did you do?" "What are you talking about?" she asked, her blood running cold. "My truck," he choked out, his voice thick with a mixture of rage and fear. "Someone came to the shop tonight. They smashed the windshield. And they spray-painted. Anna, they spray-painted something on the side." She held her breath. "What did it say, Mark?" The line was silent for a beat, and then he said the words, each one a hammer blow against the fragile hope she had just built. "It says, 'Let sleeping fires die. The police are here. They're asking questions. This is on you, Anna. It's all on you. I told you to stop. I told you." He hung up. The click of the disconnected call was deafening. She sat in her car, the engine off, the darkness of her own garage pressing in. The map, her treasured piece of victory, now felt like an indictment. She had won a clue, but the cost was her brother's safety, and whatever was left of their relationship. The high of her discovery crashed into a devastating low. The threat was no longer just a note on her windshield. It had teeth. It had reached out and touched her family, leaving a scar of broken glass and poisoned words. And she knew with chilling certainty that this was only the beginning. That night, sleep was an impossibility. She unrolled the map again, staring at the penciled X, a symbol of both hope and danger. Driven by a new, colder purpose, she went to the small box of her father's effects the city had given her mother, a formal letter of condolence, a service medal, a handful of newspaper clippings. Tucked inside was a copy of the final incident report. She read the sterile, bureaucratic language, her eyes scanning for one word. Tunnel. There was no mention. The official record, the one Abernathy and the entire town had accepted as truth, detailed the search area, the track lines, the nearby woodlands. But according to the city of Benton Creek, Maintenance Tunnel 7, the place marked with an X on the map in her hands had never existed at all. The lie was so bold, so absolute, it was almost impressive. A whole piece of infrastructure, a tunnel large enough to swallow a crew of men, erased from the official record. Anna felt a cold, hard anger crystallize in her gut. This wasn't just a cover-up, it was a rewriting of history. Mark's vandalized truck, the threat painted in stark black letters, proved that the authors of that history were still here, and they were still watching. She knew she couldn't fight this alone, armed with just a tarnished whistle and a faded map. The institutions had closed ranks. Abernathy, the police who dismissed Mark's incident as random vandalism, the silent town itself, they were all part of the wall. She needed to go over their heads. She needed to speak to someone with power, someone who couldn't simply dismiss her, which led her to City Hall and to the office of Deputy Mayor Charles Denton. Denton was the face of modern Benton Creek, polished, charismatic, and always impeccably dressed. He had built his career on the ashes of the 1981 tragedy, championing a sweeping safety modernization program for the town's emergency services. He was seen as a protector, a man who had guided the community out of its darkest hour. His office was a testament to his public image, filled with plaques, framed newspaper articles praising his leadership, and a large, commanding oak desk. He greeted Anna with a smile that was all professional warmth, his handshake firm and reassuring. "Anna Cole," he said, his voice smooth and practiced. "It's been too long. I was so sorry to hear about that business with your brother's truck. A senseless act. This town isn't what it used to be." His sympathy felt as manufactured as the plastic plant in the corner of his office. Anna took a deep breath, refusing to be disarmed by his charm. She laid out her story carefully, methodically, placing the whistle and Earl's map on the polished surface of his desk. She explained the contradictions, the official report versus the evidence in her hands. She watched his face for any flicker of recognition, any sign of genuine concern. But his expression remained a mask of polite interest. When she finished, he leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. He looked at the map, then at the whistle, with a look of mild curiosity, as if she'd brought him a quaint artifact for a school project. "This is fascinating," he said, the word dripping with insincerity. "But Anna, you have to understand, 1980, one was a chaotic time. Records were lost, memories are unreliable. A pencil mark on an old map, a common whistle, it's not much to go on." My brother was threatened," Anna said, her voice shaking with suppressed rage. "Someone vandalized his truck and left a message telling me to stop looking. This isn't about unreliable memories. Someone is actively trying to silence me." Denton's smile finally vanished. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, confidential tone that was far more menacing than a shout. "Your father was a hero. His sacrifice is a cornerstone of this town's legacy. A legacy I have spent my career protecting. By digging in graves that don't belong to you, you risk tarnishing that legacy. You risk opening wounds for families who have found their peace." His words were a perfect echo of Abernathy's, but colder, sharper, with the unmistakable glint of steel beneath them. It was a threat, delivered with the smooth precision of a politician. "Stop, or I will paint you as the villain. I will turn this town against you." The meeting was over. He stood, signaling the end of her audience, a benevolent ruler dismissing a troubled subject. She left his office feeling not just defeated, but violated. He hadn't just dismissed her, he had twisted her search for truth into an attack on her own father's memory. The outrage was a fire in her chest. This man wasn't a protector, he was a gatekeeper. The rage propelled her. If the town was a locked box, she would find her own way in. That weekend, armed with Earl's map and a small shovel, she drove out to the old switching yard. It was a wasteland of rusted tracks and crumbling concrete, nature slowly reclaiming the industrial scar. Following the faint lines on the map, she found it, or rather, where it was supposed to be. A massive gray slab of concrete, at least 20 feet high and 50 feet wide, was embedded in the side of a low hill. It was seamless, brutalist, and utterly final. This was the tomb. Weeds and thorny bushes grew thick around its base, as if even nature was trying to hide it. There was no plaque, no marker, nothing to indicate that this was anything other than a retaining wall. But she knew this was the place. For hours, she walked the perimeter, her boots sinking into the soft, damp earth. The ground near the sealed entrance was uneven, littered with old debris, and then her foot caught on something. She knelt, digging at the soil with her bare hands, then with the shovel. About a foot down, the shovel struck something hard with a dull clang. It wasn't a rock, it was metal. Heart-hammering, she carefully unearthed it. A fireman's helmet. It was melted on one side, grotesquely warped by intense heat, the leather lining rotted away. But as she wiped the grime from the inside rim, her breath caught. Scratched into the metal, faint but unmistakable, were a set of initials, not her father's. J.M. Johnny Miller. One of the men who had vanished with him. Tears streamed down her face, hot and cleansing. It was real. They were here. This wasn't just a theory anymore. It was a fact, held heavy and undeniable in her hands. This was the proof Denton couldn't dismiss, the evidence Abernathy couldn't explain away. A surge of triumphant, righteous hope flooded through her. She had them. She had the proof. She wrapped the helmet carefully in her jacket and carried it back to her car, a sacred relic. For the first time, she felt her father was truly close, not just a memory but a presence, urging her on from just beyond this concrete wall. The feeling of victory was so powerful, so absolute, that she almost didn't notice the car. It wasn't until she was on the main road, heading back into town as dusk settled, that she saw it in her rearview mirror. An older model sedan, dark blue or black, with its headlights off. It was keeping a steady distance, maybe 100 yards back. She slowed down, and it slowed down. She sped up, and it matched her pace. A cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach. This wasn't a coincidence. They had followed her. They knew she had been to the tunnel. They knew she had found something. She made a series of quick, nonsensical turns through a residential neighborhood, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The car stayed with her, a silent, predatory shadow. It wasn't chasing her. It was herding her, making sure she knew she was being watched. When she finally pulled into her own driveway, her hands shaking so badly she could barely turn the key, she looked in the mirror one last time. The car had stopped at the end of her street, a dark shape against the fading light, and then, slowly, it pulled away and disappeared into the night. She stumbled out of her car and into her house, locking the door behind her. The melted helmet, her symbol of hope and triumph, sat on the passenger seat. But now, it felt less like a key to the truth and more like a warning, a piece of bait that had drawn the sharks out of the deep. They weren't just going to threaten her brother anymore, they were coming for her. The fear was a living thing now, a constant companion that sat beside her in the car and stood behind her in every shadow. For 2 days, Anna did nothing. She went to work, she came home, she double-checked the locks on her doors and windows. The melted helmet sat wrapped in a towel in the trunk of her car, a secret she was too afraid to share and too stubborn to abandon. The surveillance had worked. She was paralyzed. The feeling of being watched had seeped into the walls of her house, turning her sanctuary into a place of suffocating anxiety. She knew with a gut-wrenching certainty that her every move was being monitored. This was exactly what they wanted, to scare her back into the silence she had occupied for 34 years. And it was working. She thought about Mark, his fear-filled voice on the phone, the jagged crack in his windshield. She thought about her daughter Lily, and the life of quiet safety she had worked so hard to build for them. Was uncovering the truth worth shattering that peace? The doubt was a poison, seeping into the cracks of her resolve. Maybe Mark was right. Maybe Denton was right. Maybe some graves were meant to stay closed. She needed to talk to Earl. She found him not on his porch, but in his garage, tinkering with the engine of an old lawnmower. The air was thick with the smell of oil and dust. He took one look at her face and knew something was wrong. He wiped his hands on a rag and led her into his small, cluttered kitchen. As she told him about Denton's veiled threats and the terrifying silent pursuit from the tunnel, he listened, his expression growing darker. When she finished, he didn't offer empty reassurances. He simply nodded, as if confirming a long-held suspicion. "They're not just gatekeepers, Anna," he said, his voice low. "They're guardians. There's a difference. A gatekeeper just keeps you out. A guardian will do whatever it takes to protect what's inside." He walked over to a tall metal filing cabinet in the corner, the kind you'd see in an old office, and unlocked it with a key from his pocket. From a drawer filled with schematics and old railway manuals, he pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger. It was a fire station radio log, dated 1981. "I borrowed this," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "The night after it happened, before things started to get cleaned up, I had a feeling someone might want to misplace it." He opened the book, the spine creaking in protest. The pages were filled with neat cursive handwriting, a meticulous record of every call, every dispatch, every crackle of static that had passed through the station's radio. He ran his finger down the page for October 17th. Most of the entries were mundane: a fender bender on Main Street, a false alarm at the old mill. And then, at the bottom of the page, was the last entry of the night. The ink was slightly smeared, the handwriting more frantic than the entries above it. The time was logged at 11:42 p.m. The message was chilling in its stark simplicity. "Crew trapped. South Access Tunnel 7. Smoke rising. Blocked by freight." Anna stared at the words, her breath catching in her throat. Trapped. Blocked by freight. It wasn't a track fire. It was a trap. The official story of a small, routine fire was a deliberate, calculated lie. They had been sent into a tunnel that was then blocked by a freight train and then sealed from the outside world. It wasn't an accident, it was murder. The horror of it was so immense, so cold-blooded, that it momentarily eclipsed her fear. This wasn't just about a cover-up to avoid blame. This was about concealing an atrocity. The logbook was the evidence she needed, a voice from the grave speaking a truth that had been silenced for over 3 decades. That night, she sat with Lily at the kitchen table, the warmth of the small room a stark contrast to the icy dread in her veins. She hadn't wanted to involve her daughter, had tried to shield her from the ugliness of it all, but she couldn't carry this alone anymore. She showed Lily a photograph of the log entry, explaining what it meant. Lily, with her bright, intuitive eyes, didn't flinch. She traced the frantic handwriting with her finger, her expression one of quiet, fierce determination. "Grandpa would be so proud of you, Mom," she said, her voice soft but sure. "He promised he'd always come back for you. Maybe finding him is your way of letting him come back for us." The simple, heartfelt wisdom of her daughter's words cut through Anna's fear and doubt. This wasn't an obsession that would destroy her family, as Mark believed. It was a promise she had to keep for them. In that quiet, intimate moment, a new strength bloomed in Anna's chest. The fear was still there, but now so was hope, anchored by the love of her daughter. She would be smarter, more careful. From then on, she set up a buddy system with Earl. She texted Lily her location every time she went to meet him or visit a site. She was no longer just a reckless truth-seeker, she was a mother, protecting her own, even as she fought for the father she had lost. Her next move was to the city archives, armed with the knowledge of the tunnel and the freight train. She needed to know who was in charge of the rail lines that night, who gave the orders. But as she requested the municipal records and railroad dispatch logs for October 1981, she was met with a polite, bureaucratic stonewall. The clerk, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 20, returned from the back room with an apologetic smile. "I'm so sorry," she said. "It seems those records were all destroyed. There was a flood in the basement storage unit back in the 90s. A real shame. We lost everything from that era. A flood, an accident. Another convenient act of God designed to erase the past." Anna's heart sank, but as she turned to leave, her eyes met those of the clerk. And for a fleeting second, she saw something flicker in the young woman's gaze. Not pity, but fear. As Anna walked out of the archives, a cold realization dawned on her. Denton's reach was longer than she'd thought. He wasn't just a deputy mayor. He was the protector of a citywide conspiracy. That afternoon, feeling the walls closing in, she returned to the one place she thought was a sanctuary, the one institution she believed stood for truth, St. Jude's Church. She sought out Pastor Raymond, a man whose gentle sermons and calm demeanor had been a source of comfort to the town for years. She hoped he, as a man of God, would help her, would lend his moral authority to her cause. He listened to her story in his quiet, sunlit office, his hands folded peacefully on his desk. He looked at the photo of the radiolog, his expression one of deep sorrow. "This is a terrible burden for you to carry, Anna," he said, his voice a soothing balm. "Your father and those men, their loss was a wound on the soul of this community." He paused, and Anna felt a surge of hope. He understood. He would help. "Which is precisely why," the pastor continued, his voice hardening ever so slightly, "we had to do what we did. After the accident, the town was in chaos. There were rumors, anger, people looking for someone to blame. Sealing that tunnel was a difficult but necessary decision. It was an act of mercy, Anna. It allowed the wound to close. It allowed the town to heal." Anna stared at him, dumbfounded. The betrayal was so sudden, so complete, it stole her breath. An act of mercy? They had buried men alive and called it healing. "You knew?" she whispered, the words barely audible. "You helped them?" "I helped the town," he corrected gently. "I was part of the community council that lobbied the city to seal it, for the good of the town. Sometimes, the Lord asks us to accept painful truths and move on, not to rip open old scars." She stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. The sunlit office suddenly felt like a tomb. The pastor, the man of God, was not just complicit, He was a willing architect of the lie. The institutions of Benton Creek, its government, its history, its faith, were all built on the same foundation of concrete and silence. And she was standing completely, terrifyingly alone. The pastor's betrayal was a different kind of wound. It wasn't the cold dismissal of a bureaucrat or the veiled threat of a politician. It was the calm, reasoned justification of a moral crime, delivered from a place of supposed authority. Anna left the church feeling as though the very ground beneath Benton Creek had become unstable. There was no one left to trust. The weight of the conspiracy pressed down on her, suffocating and vast. She was tempted, for one terrifying moment, to simply give up. To take Lily and leave town, to let the sleeping fires die, just as the note on her brother's truck had commanded. She could retreat back into the quiet, predictable life of a librarian, where the only mysteries were contained within the pages of a book. But the image of the frantic handwriting in the radio log, crew trapped, smoke rising, wouldn't let her go. Giving up wasn't just letting her father down, it was letting his murderers win. That evening she drove to Earl's house, her resolve hardened by despair into a sharp, dangerous edge. "They've erased every official record," she told him, her voice flat and cold. "The archives, the railroad logs, even the church. They've built a fortress of lies around that tunnel. We'll never get in through the front door." Earl took a long, slow draw from his pipe, his eyes thoughtful. "Then we don't use the door," he said, a determined glint in his eye. "The old switching yard, it's a graveyard now, but the company still owns the land. They keep a maintenance shed on the north end, full of old equipment. If we're going to find any other unofficial records, any scraps they forgot to burn, that's where they'd be." It was a reckless, desperate idea, breaking into a locked shed on private property. But Anna felt a flicker of life, of defiance, returning to her. The institutions had failed her. The official channels were closed. It was time to go around them. Her decision was made with a chilling clarity. Sometimes, to find justice, you had to be willing to break the law. That night, under the sliver of a moon, they drove out to the rail yard, parking a quarter-mile away and walking the rest of the way through the wet, overgrown fields. The silence was absolute, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a train. The maintenance shed was a rust-streaked metal box, secured with a heavy-duty padlock. Earl, it turned out, had come prepared. He produced a set of bolt cutters from a canvas bag, and with a single, sharp snap, the lock fell away. The sound echoed in the stillness like a gunshot. For a heart-stopping moment, they froze, listening. But there was nothing. Just the wind, sighing through the tall grass. The air inside the shed was thick and stagnant, heavy with the smell of rust, oil, and decay. Cobwebs as thick as cotton hung from the rafters. Their flashlights cut through the gloom, revealing shelves piled high with discarded parts, tools, and stacks of water-stained boxes. It was a tomb of forgotten work. They started searching, their movements hushed and urgent. It was hopeless, a needle in a haystack of industrial refuse. Most of the boxes contained invoices for machine parts or outdated safety manuals. Minutes stretched into an hour. The damp cold began to seep into Anna's bones, and with it, the familiar tendrils of despair. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe there was nothing here. She was about to suggest they leave when her light fell on a small metal footlocker tucked away under a workbench, almost completely obscured by a pile of greasy rags. It was locked, but the metal was thin and rusted. Using a crowbar from the workbench, Earl pried the lid open with a groan of tortured metal. Inside, nestled on a bed of moldy papers, was a collection of personal effects, a tarnished silver flask, a deck of playing cards, and a small leather-bound journal. It was scorched along the edges and badly water-damaged, the pages warped and stuck together. Anna lifted it out as if it were made of spun glass. With painstaking care, she began to separate the stiff, fragile pages. Most of the writing was an illegible smudge of ink and water stain. It was a diary, filled with notes about work shifts, poker games, and complaints about the food at the local diner. It belonged to a fireman named David Peterson, another member of her father's crew. Then, near the back, she found it. A single entry, dated October 17, 1981. The handwriting was rushed, almost a scribble, but it was miraculously, terrifyingly legible. It read, "Call came in for a track fire by Tunnel 7. Smells wrong. Danny doesn't like it. He says it's a setup. We're going in anyway. We hear the train coming. No one listening on the radio. No one listening. God help us." The journal slipped from her fingers. The words hung in the dusty air, a final, desperate broadcast from a dying man. No one listening. The radio wasn't broken. It was being ignored. It confirmed the cold-blooded reality of the logbook. They had called for help, and someone, somewhere, had made the decision to let them die. A wave of nausea and rage washed over Anna. This was it, the smoking gun, a first-hand account from inside the trap. For a dizzying, brilliant moment, she felt an overwhelming sense of triumph. This was the proof that no one could deny. This was the voice that would bring the fortress of lies crashing down. The feeling didn't last. A sudden hacking cough from Earl shattered the silence. He doubled over, gasping for air, his face pale in the beam of her flashlight. The decades of dust and mold spores had hit him hard, triggering something in his old, tired lungs. He was struggling to breathe, his wheezing breaths echoing horribly in the small, confined space. Panic, sharp and cold, seized Anna. She helped him outside into the night air, his arm heavy around her shoulder. He collapsed onto the wet grass, each breath a painful, ragged struggle. His face was turning a frightening shade of gray. Leaving the journal behind was unthinkable. Rushing back inside, she grabbed the footlocker and its contents, her mind racing. She had to get him to a hospital. Forgetting all caution, she helped him to the car and sped toward the emergency room, the rules of her own safety system forgotten in the desperate urgency of the moment. She didn't text Lily. She didn't call for backup. Her only thought was of Earl. At the hospital, as the doctors and nurses rushed him into a treatment room, Anna was left alone in the stark, fluorescent glare of the waiting area. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a gnawing anxiety. And then, 2 police officers walked through the automatic doors. They weren't there for a medical emergency. They walked straight toward her. "Ma'am?" the older one said, his face a grim, unreadable mask. "We had a report of a break-in at the old rail yard. A witness saw your vehicle leaving the scene. We're going to need you to come with us to answer some questions about trespassing." Denton. It had to be Denton. The speed of the response was too perfect, too efficient. They hadn't been caught by a random witness. They had been seen by one of his watchers. He had allowed them to find something, knowing he could snatch it away at the moment of their triumph. The footlocker with the journal was sitting on the floor beside her. The officer's eyes flickered down toward it. This was sabotage, a trap laid with exquisite cruelty. She had walked right into it, so blinded by her discovery and her concern for Earl that she hadn't seen the bigger picture. She was about to be arrested, and the single most important piece of evidence she had ever found was about to be confiscated, buried forever in an evidence locker. And as the officers led her away, a local reporter, camera in hand, stepped out from behind a pillar, a flashbulb popping in her face. The reporter's presence was no coincidence. Denton wasn't just neutralizing her, he was publicly discrediting her. The next day's headline was already written in her mind: "Daughter of missing fire chief, arrested in bizarre break-in, exploiting father's death." He was branding her a criminal, a hysteric, a disruptor. He was turning her quest for justice into a sideshow, ensuring that no one in Benton Creek would ever listen to a word she said again. The victory she had held in her hands for a few brilliant moments had turned to ash. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot flush of shame that lingered long after the camera flash faded. Anna spent 4 hours in a small, windowless interrogation room at the police station, the scorched journal from the footlocker sealed in an evidence bag on the table in front of her. They didn't ask her about her father. They didn't ask about the tunnel. They asked her about trespassing, about breaking and entering. The questions were a smokescreen, a tedious bureaucratic exercise designed to wear her down, to make her feel small and criminal. She was released just before dawn, charged with a misdemeanor and given a court date. The journal, her priceless piece of truth, was kept as evidence. Denton's plan was flawless. He had not only disarmed her, he had turned her own actions into a weapon against her. When she finally got home, exhausted and defeated, she found Lily awake in the living room, her face pale with worry. But the first person who called wasn't her daughter. It was her boss from the library, his voice tight with discomfort. The local news website had already run the story, complete with the unflattering photo of her being led away by police. He told her, in a roundabout apologetic way, that it would be best if she took a leave of absence until this all blew over. She had been fired. In less than 12 hours, Denton had cost her her evidence, her reputation, and her job. The public shaming worked exactly as intended. Old friends now averted their gaze when she saw them in the grocery store. The whispers followed her down the aisles. The narrative had been set. She was an unhinged woman, consumed by a decades-old grief, dishonoring her heroic father's memory. The loneliness was a crushing weight. She felt like an outcast in her own hometown. The walls weren't just closing in, they had collapsed, burying her in the rubble of her own life. For days, she did nothing but sit in the quiet of her house, the silence amplifying the taunts and accusations in her head. She had failed. She had fought the system, and the system had won, easily and decisively. It was Lily who finally pulled her out of the spiral. She found her mother staring blankly out the kitchen window and came to stand beside her, placing a hand on her arm. "You can't let him win, Mom," she said, her voice filled with a strength that belied her age. "They want you to be quiet. They want you to be scared. So what are you going to do? Are you going to give them what they want?" The question hung in the air, simple and profound. Was she going to let a man like Denton dictate the end of her father's story, the end of her story? A flicker of defiance sparked in the darkness. He had taken her evidence, but he hadn't taken her knowledge. He had stained her reputation, but he couldn't erase the truth. The anger returned, cold and clear. She was done playing by their rules. She was done seeking permission from institutions that were built to protect the guilty. If the city wouldn't open the tunnel, she would find a way to force their hand. An idea began to form, born of desperation and Lily's unwavering faith. Denton had used the town's reverence for its heroes against her. Now she would use it against him. Benton Creek was a deeply patriotic town, with a large community of military veterans who held a fierce respect for first responders. Her father had been one of them, a Marine who served in Vietnam before he ever put on a fireman's uniform. These were men and women who understood duty, sacrifice, and the unbreakable code of leaving no one behind. With Lily's help, she began to craft a petition. It wasn't an angry tirade or a list of accusations. It was a simple, emotional appeal. It called for the city to unseal and inspect Maintenance Tunnel 7, not as part of a criminal investigation, but as a memorial act to recover the remains of fallen heroes and give their families a final resting place. They framed it as a matter of honor. They started small, going door to door, not to the town's officials or business leaders, but to the veterans at the local VFW hall. Anna told her story, not as a conspiracy theorist, but as a daughter trying to bring her father home. She showed them the photo of the radio log. She described the melted helmet. She spoke of honor and a debt owed to the men who had died in service to the town. The response was slow at first, a few suspicious glances and non-committal nods. But then one old veteran, a man who had served with her father in the Marines, signed his name with a firm, decisive stroke. "Dan Cole was a good man," he said, his voice raspy. "He deserves better than to be left in a concrete hole." His signature was the first crack in the dam. Soon, others followed. The petition gained momentum, spreading from the VFW hall to the fire department's union, to the families of the other missing firemen who, for years, had been too afraid or too weary to ask questions. They were no longer just Anna's accusations. They were the community's demands. The petition, with over 500 signatures, landed on the desk of the city council like a grenade. Denton was furious. Anna watched the televised city council meeting from her living room as he stood at the podium, his usual polished charm replaced with a barely concealed rage. He called the petition a reckless and emotionally manipulative stunt that threatened the structural integrity of the hillside. He spoke of budgets, of safety concerns, of the need to protect the town from unnecessary emotional trauma. But for the first time, his words didn't land. The chamber was packed with veterans and the families of the fallen, their silent, stoic presence, a powerful rebuttal to his political maneuvering. The council was trapped. To deny the petition would be political suicide, an insult to the town's most respected citizens. Reluctantly, with Denton casting the lone dissenting vote, they approved a temporary, limited inspection of the tunnel's entrance. It was a staggering victory. Anna felt a surge of hope, so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. She hadn't just fought back, she had rallied an army. She had turned Denton's greatest weapon, the town's reverence for its heroes, against him. The day of the inspection was cold and gray, a fitting atmosphere for opening a tomb. A small crew of city engineers accompanied by Anna Earl, now recovered and breathing easier, and a few of the veteran leaders gathered in front of the massive concrete slab. The work was slow, the engineers drilling core samples and using ground-penetrating radar. For hours they found nothing but solid concrete. Denton's smug predictions of a fruitless, expensive exercise seemed to be coming true. Anna's hope began to fray, and then one of the engineers called out. He was pointing at a section of the wall, about 6 feet from the ground. Embedded deep within the concrete, something had reflected the radar signal. A piece of metal. They used a heavy-duty drill to bore a small hole, just a few inches in diameter, and inserted a fiber optic camera. The image that appeared on the small monitor screen made the air go still. It was the tip of a fire axe, the blade buried in stone, the wooden handle snapped off. It was angled upward, as if it had been swung with desperate, frantic force from inside. They were there. They had been trying to claw their way out. The image was a gut punch, a silent scream across 34 years. Anna knelt on the cold ground, her hand pressed against the unyielding concrete, and whispered a prayer. She could feel him, feel the ghost of his last, desperate moments. He was here. He was finally coming home. That night, as the city prepared for a more extensive excavation, a fierce storm rolled in, unleashing a torrential downpour. The victory was fragile, and Anna felt a deep, gnawing unease. It had all been too easy. Denton had lost the public battle, but he was not a man who accepted defeat. The next morning she got a frantic call from one of the engineers. The drill holes from the day before, combined with the massive influx of rain, had compromised the integrity of the concrete seal. Water was pouring into the tunnel. The site was unstable, flooded, and had been declared unsafe. The excavation was postponed indefinitely. It was a devastating setback, a cruel twist of fate that snatched their victory away at the last second. But as Anna stood with Earl, looking at the danger tape cordoning off the site, he put a heavy hand on her shoulder. His face was grim. "That was no accident, Anna," he said, his voice low. "That storm was heavy, but not that heavy. Someone helped that flood along. Someone who knew exactly where to drill to cause the maximum amount of damage." But it was what he said next that sent a true chill down her spine, a fear deeper than any she had felt before. "This reminds me of something," he murmured, his eyes distant. "Back in the 70s, before your dad's crew, there were 2 other incidents, railroad workers. They went missing near that same stretch of track. Their disappearances were ruled as accidents, runaways. The reports were sealed. No one ever connected them. Until now." The scale of the conspiracy suddenly expanded, becoming monstrously, terrifyingly vast. Her father's crew wasn't the beginning. They were just the latest victims. Earl's revelation was like a rogue wave, pulling Anna under into a much colder, darker, and deeper ocean of conspiracy than she had ever imagined. This wasn't just about her father. This was a pattern. A system of disappearances, conveniently ruled as accidents, all connected to one location, one stretch of forgotten track. The accidental flood, the sabotage of the excavation, it wasn't just about protecting a 34-year-old secret. It was about protecting a legacy of murder that went back even further. The frustration was a bitter pill. She had the town behind her, the moral high ground, and a victory from the city council. Yet she was powerless, defeated by a timely storm and a wall of safety regulations. Denton had outmaneuvered her again. using the town's own procedures to halt the one thing he couldn't stop through politics. Who had that kind of power? Who could orchestrate not just political cover-ups, but physical sabotage with such precision? The question led her down a new path. Not to the city archives, which she now knew were useless, but to the dusty, neglected newspaper archives in the library's basement, her own domain. She wasn't looking for stories about the firemen anymore. She was looking for the 2 missing railroad workers from the 70s that Earl had mentioned. For days, she immersed herself in microfilm, the rhythmic clicking of the machine, a soundtrack to her obsessive search. She scrolled through years of local news, past stories of town fairs, high school football victories, and zoning disputes, and then she found them. 2 small, insignificant articles, buried deep in the back pages. The first, from 1974, reported a worker named Samuel Jones missing after a rock slide near the switching yard. The second, from 1977, described a maintenance engineer, George Bell, who vanished while inspecting the tracks, presumed to have fallen into the fast-flowing creek nearby. Both cases were closed within weeks. No foul play suspected. Runaways. Accidents. The names were different, but the pattern was chillingly familiar. A disappearance. A convenient, unquestioned explanation. A swift, silent closure. The articles themselves were unremarkable, but it was the name of the railroad line manager quoted in both pieces that made Anna's blood run cold. The man expressing his deep regret and assuring the public that the company was fully cooperating with the investigation was a man named Harold Denton, Charles Denton's father. The connection was an electric shock, illuminating the entire web of deceit. This wasn't just a political legacy Charles Denton was protecting, it was a family legacy. A legacy of corruption, of secrets, and of bodies buried in the name of progress or profit. Harold Denton had been in charge when the workers vanished. Harold Denton had been the line manager who oversaw the sealing of the tunnel in 1981, the very man who would have given the order to block the tracks with a freight train. And his son, Deputy Mayor Charles Denton, was now the guardian of those secrets, using the full weight of his political power to ensure they remained buried forever. The outrage Anna felt was pure and absolute. This was not a man protecting a town. This was a son protecting his father, a criminal dynasty cloaked in civic duty. She felt a surge of adrenaline, of purpose. She now knew the why. She knew the who. All she needed was the proof to connect the father to the son, the past to the present. Her research became a frantic, desperate race against time. She knew Denton's people were still watching her. She felt their eyes every time she left her house. But now, she knew what she was looking for. She dug into old railroad company stockholder reports, municipal planning documents from the 70s, anything that might bear Harold Denton's name. She found what she was looking for, not in a public record, but in a box of her own father's old papers. He had been on the fire department's pension and investment committee, and tucked away in a file of old financial statements was a stack of annual reports from the Benton Creek Rail Corporation. And inside the report from 1982, she found the hidden truth, a ledger, not an official one, but a separate handwritten annex detailing special disbursements for the previous year. It was a list of names, the widows of Samuel Jones and George Bell, and several other railroad workers she didn't recognize. Beside each name was a substantial sum of money, labeled as an ex gratia payment. It wasn't a pension, it wasn't a settlement, it was hush money. A series of payouts to the families of anyone who had worked near that tunnel and might have questioned the official stories. It was a ledger of silence, signed at the bottom by Harold Denton. This was it, the final, undeniable link, the proof of the cover-up, in Harold Denton's own hand. She held the document, her hands trembling. It was more powerful than the whistle, more damning than the fireman's journal. This ledger could bring down the entire Denton legacy. That night, feeling a sense of impending victory, she began planning her next move. She would hold a town memorial service for her father and his crew at the entrance to the sealed tunnel. The whole town would be there, the veterans, the families, the local news. And at that service, she would reveal the ledger. She would expose Harold Denton's crimes and Charles Denton's cover-up in front of everyone. It would be a public execution, a trial held in the court of public opinion, where Denton's political maneuvering would be useless. The plan was perfect, it was righteous, and it was exactly the kind of move Denton would be expecting. The evening before the planned memorial, Lily was home from a friend's house, her face unusually pale. "Mom," she began, her voice small, "a man came to talk to me today, on my way home from school." Anna's heart stopped. "What man?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "He was nice," Lily said, clearly trying to downplay her own fear. "He was wearing a suit. He knew my name. He said, I should tell you not to let your mother destroy everything your grandfather built." The threat was so vile, so despicable, it transcended anything that had come before. Denton was no longer targeting her reputation or her job, he was threatening her child. The outrage that had been simmering in Anna for weeks exploded into a white-hot protective fury. This was a line that should never have been crossed. He had made this personal in the most unforgivable way. The fear for her daughter was a primal physical thing, but it was quickly eclipsed by a cold, hard rage. The memorial service was no longer just about justice, it was about vengeance. She checked on Lily, who had fallen into an uneasy sleep, and then went to the desk where she had hidden the ledger. She would make copies. She would give one to Earl. She would send one to a state newspaper. She would not let this piece of evidence be her single point of failure again. She opened the drawer. It was empty. The ledger was gone. A cold dread, more profound than any fear she had yet experienced, washed over her. She frantically searched the room, pulling out drawers, scattering papers, her panic mounting with every empty space. It was no use. It was gone. Someone had been in her house. While she was out, while Lily was at school, someone had slipped in and taken the one piece of evidence that could have destroyed Charles Denton. He hadn't just threatened her daughter. He had disarmed her, one final time, on the very eve of her victory. The hope that had burned so brightly just hours before was extinguished, leaving her in a darkness more complete and terrifying than any that had come before. She was alone, unprotected, with a monster who had just threatened her child and a town that was about to watch her fail. The theft of the ledger was the most devastating blow yet. It was a masterstroke of cruelty, executed with silent, chilling precision. Denton hadn't just stolen a piece of paper, he had stolen her voice, her power, her final desperate hope for justice. The fear that washed over Anna was profound and suffocating. It wasn't the fear of being watched or followed anymore. It was the absolute soul-crushing terror of a mother whose child had been marked by a predator. He had been in her home, the sanctuary she had built for her daughter, and he had sent a message more terrifying than any spray-painted warning. "I can get to you. I can get to your child. There is nowhere you are safe." Every instinct screamed at her to cancel the memorial, to pack a bag and take Lily and run, to disappear into the anonymity of another city where the name Denton meant nothing. To surrender. But the thought of Denton winning, of him standing over the wreckage of her life with his polished, predatory smile, was intolerable. The fear warred with the rage, a roiling, chaotic storm in her heart. Surrender was not an option. Not after he had threatened her daughter. The memorial would go on. But now she would be walking into it utterly defenseless, armed only with a story that, without the ledger, would sound like the desperate ramblings of a broken woman. The next morning, the day of the memorial, dawned gray and heavy, the sky a bruised purple. The air was thick with a tension that felt personal, as if the very weather was mourning what was about to happen. Anna's phone buzzed with a notification. Charles Denton had called a press conference at City Hall an hour before her memorial was scheduled to begin. It was a preemptive strike, a classic political maneuver to seize control of the narrative. Standing in front of the local news cameras, Denton was the picture of somber, concerned leadership. He spoke of the deep and painful wounds of 1981. He praised Anna's understandable though misguided passion as a grieving daughter. And then, he delivered the killing blow. He spoke of her arrest, her leave of absence from the library, and her increasingly erratic behavior. He framed her quest for truth as a public spectacle born of instability, a cry for help from a woman who couldn't let go of the past. He was poisoning the well, ensuring that by the time she stood up to speak, the crowd would already see her as a tragic, unreliable figure. The outrage Anna felt was so intense it was dizzying. He was using her pain, twisting it, and broadcasting it as a weapon against her. He was a monster cloaked in the robes of a public servant. When Anna arrived at the sealed tunnel, a crowd had already gathered. The veterans were there, their faces grim and resolute. The families of the other firemen stood in a tight, nervous cluster. But the rest of the crowd was a mixture of morbid curiosity and suspicion. Denton's press conference had done its job. She could see the doubt in their eyes, the whispers passing between them. As she walked to the makeshift podium, a profound sense of failure washed over her. She was about to give the speech of her life with no proof, no credibility, and no hope. The weight of all her losses, her father, her brother's trust, her job, her evidence, her reputation, pressed down on her. And then she saw Earl. He was standing near the edge of the crowd, his face pale but his eyes burning with a fierce light. He caught her eye and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He held up his phone and then tapped his coat pocket. A jolt went through Anna, a sudden, impossible flicker of hope. He had a copy. The realization was so stunning, so powerful, that for a moment she couldn't breathe. Earl, the quiet, unassuming train engineer, had secretly photographed the ledger. He had made a backup. As Denton's press conference finished streaming on people's phones, Anna stepped up to the podium. The crowd quieted, their expressions a mixture of pity and skepticism. She took a deep breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't begin with accusations. She began with a story. She spoke of her father, not as a hero in a uniform, but as a man who smelled of coffee and wood smoke, who used to blow a brass whistle to call his children home. Her voice, raw with emotion, cut through the murmuring of the crowd. She spoke of his promise, "I'll always come back for you." Then her voice hardened. She told them about the radio log. She told them about the fireman's journal. And then she looked directly into the lens of the local news camera. "Deputy Mayor Denton told you this morning that I am unstable," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound power. "He told you I am exploiting a tragedy. What he didn't tell you is why he is so desperate to silence me. He is not protecting this town's legacy, he is protecting his father's." At that moment, Earl stepped forward. He didn't say a word. He simply walked to the reporter from the local paper and handed him a single, clear, high-resolution photograph of Harold Denton's hush money ledger. A ripple went through the crowd as the reporter's eyes widened, and he showed the photo to those standing nearest to him. The murmurs grew into a roar. People surged forward, phones held high, taking pictures of the photograph, the image of the ledger spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Outrage erupted, raw and immediate. It was no longer Anna's word against Denton's. It was a damning, undeniable piece of evidence. The families of the missing firemen began to weep, not just from grief, but from 34 years of suppressed anger. The veterans started chanting, their voices a low, rumbling demand. "Open the tunnel! Open the tunnel!" The shift in the atmosphere was instantaneous and absolute. The town, which had been so quick to doubt her, was now united in a furious cry for justice. The balance of power had shattered. Denton, who had arrived to oversee the memorial from a distance, confident in his victory, suddenly found himself surrounded. The crowd turned on him, their faces masks of fury. His polished composure cracked, revealing the panicked, cornered animal beneath. He tried to speak, to offer denials, but his voice was drowned out by the shouts of "murderer" and "liar." It was a public unraveling, a complete and total destruction of the image he had so carefully crafted. In the chaos, as the city council members who were present began making frantic phone calls, 2 police cars arrived. But they weren't for Anna. They pushed through the enraged crowd and escorted a stunned, defeated Charles Denton away, not for his protection, but for questioning. In the wake of his departure, a decision was made, not by a vote, but by the undeniable will of the people. The excavation would resume, immediately. City engineers were called, heavy machinery rerouted. The delay was over. The wall was coming down. But as the first massive drill was moved into place, a police sergeant approached Anna. "Ma'am," he said, his voice now respectful, almost deferential. "Mr. Denton is being detained, but his lawyers are very aggressive. He's already filed a restraining order against you for harassment. He's claiming you're unstable and a threat. During this initial excavation, for your own safety, and to prevent any accusations of evidence tampering, we're going to have to ask you to stay behind this police line." He pointed to a strip of yellow tape 100 yards away. It was Denton's final desperate act of spite, a legal maneuver from a jail cell to deny her the one thing she had fought for. She was being separated from her father's grave at the very moment it was about to be opened. She was being pushed to the sidelines, forced to watch the culmination of her fight from a distance like a spectator. She stood at the edge of the police tape, the victory she had just won turning to ash in her mouth. She faced a choice. She could obey, step back, and let the authorities handle it, validating Denton's final, parting shot that she was an unstable element that needed to be contained. Or she could defy them, walk into the excavation site, and risk arrest one more time. The cameras were rolling, the entire town was watching. Her courage had brought her this far. And as the sound of the drill biting into the concrete echoed through the valley, she made her choice. She took a deep breath, ducked under the yellow tape, and started walking toward the tunnel. She would not be silenced. She would not be sidelined. She was coming home for her father. Walking past the yellow tape was the longest, most deliberate walk of Anna's life. Every step was an act of defiance. The police sergeant took a step toward her, his hand raised, his expression a mixture of duty and frustration. But then he stopped. He looked at her face, etched with a grief and determination that transcended any local ordinance, and then he looked at the crowd. Hundreds of people, their faces grim, were watching. The veterans stood like a silent honor guard. To arrest her now, in front of them, would be to arrest the very idea of justice they had all come here to witness. With a sigh of resignation, he simply lowered his hand and stepped aside. No one was going to stop her. She had won. As she approached the gaping maw of the tunnel, the air grew colder, thick with the smell of wet earth and something else, a deep, ancient sorrow. The engineers had cut a large opening in the concrete wall, revealing the dark, cavernous space beyond. For hours, they worked, their heavy machinery groaning as it pulled away massive chunks of concrete and earth. With every piece removed, another layer of history was peeled back. And then they found it. It wasn't a fire truck or a dramatic scene of skeletons frozen in time. It was something quieter and somehow more heartbreaking. A pile of equipment. Fire helmets, oxygen tanks, heavy turnout coats, and axes, all heaped together near a massive rockfall that had caved in a section of the tunnel's roof. This was where they had made their last stand. The placement of the equipment told the story with chilling clarity. They had been trapped between the rockfall behind them and the blocked entrance in front of them, the freight train a steel wall sealing their fate. The smoke, reported in the radio log, hadn't been from the small track fire at all. It was the diesel fumes from the train, pouring into the enclosed space, slowly, methodically, poisoning the air. They hadn't burned, they had suffocated. A medical examiner, somber and professional, moved among the artifacts, but it was clear that the passage of 34 years and the constant dampness of the earth had left little behind. There would be no bodies to bring home, just these rusted, tarnished relics. The physical remains of the firemen were gone, reclaimed by the earth. All that was left was the truth. Justice, when it finally arrived, was swift and merciless. Faced with the undeniable evidence from the tunnel, the ledger, and the public testimony that began to flood in from old railroad workers, Charles Denton was forced to resign in disgrace. The subsequent investigation into his and his father's activities became the biggest scandal in the town's history. Benton Creek was finally forced to look at the ugly truth it had so conveniently buried. A week later, the town held a proper memorial service, not a staged photo op, but a true and solemn remembrance at the now open mouth of the tunnel. The names of the firemen were read aloud, no longer as victims of a tragic accident, but as heroes who had been murdered and silenced. They were at last coming home, not in caskets, but in honor. Anna stood with Lily and Earl, watching as a new bronze plaque, listing the names of the fallen, was unveiled. It was a victory, but a hollow one. The taste was profoundly, achingly bittersweet. Denton was ruined, but her father was still gone. The truth was out, but it couldn't turn back time. The wound that had defined her life had been lanced, but the scar would remain forever. She saw her brother, Mark, standing at the edge of the crowd, his expression unreadable. He had come. It was a start, but as their eyes met, he simply gave a small, sad nod and turned away. The rift between them, born of fear and years of unspoken grief, had not been healed by the truth. It had only been calcified by it. He had wanted to protect his family from pain, and in her relentless pursuit of their father's ghost, she had only proven his fears correct. The cost of her victory was a piece of her own living family. After the service, as the crowd began to disperse, leaving flowers and small tokens at the tunnel entrance, a city worker approached Anna. He handed her a small, tagged evidence bag. Inside was her father's brass whistle. "We found this," he said simply, tucked inside his coat. She took the bag, her fingers trembling. This was it. The artifact that had started it all. She carefully took it out. But as she held it in her palm, a final, chilling realization dawned on her. This wasn't just a piece of her father's equipment. It was the exact same whistle she had found in the church donation box. The same unique dents, the same scratches around the initials. It couldn't be a coincidence. Someone had retrieved this whistle from the tunnel, long after her father was gone, long after the entrance was sealed in concrete. Someone with access, someone on the inside, had held on to this single piece of evidence for decades. A complicit worker, perhaps, who had stayed silent out of fear, only to try and ease his conscience in his final days by leaving it in a church donation box, a final, anonymous plea for the truth to be found. The conspiracy had not just been at the top. The silence had roots that ran deep through the town. The victory felt even more complicated now, tainted by the knowledge of how many people had known, how many had chosen to look away. There was no clean line between heroes and villains, just a murky gray of fear, guilt, and compromise. Alone now, as the last of the sunlight faded from the sky, Anna walked to the mouth of the tunnel. The air that flowed out was cool and clean. She brought the whistle to her lips, the cold metal a familiar weight. She blew into it softly, not the 3 sharp bursts of her childhood, but a single, low, mournful note that echoed in the dark, empty space. It was a final, quiet conversation, a promise kept across an impossible divide. She whispered into the echoing silence. The words meant only for him and for herself. "You came back for me, Dad," she said, tears finally tracing a path down her cheeks. "I came back for you. The fight was over. The dead had been honored. The lies had been broken." But as she stood at the edge of that dark, empty tunnel, she knew that true peace, the kind that came with a whole and unbroken heart, would forever remain just out of reach.